So, given the conversation about the future of urban mobility, specifically in the context of sustainability and smart cities, it's quite interesting we find ourselves in the situation we are post-COVID and quarantine. A very interesting trend has happened as a result, you could say the perfect storm, as a result of global quarantine, which has forced a lot of people to talk about digital transformation and the acceleration of digital transformation. A lot of these technologies have been around for about 20 years now, but we didn't see the accelerated rate of change that we are now seeing as a result of Corona and the global lockdown. And essentially people have been forced to look for solutions that, as I mentioned, existed but were not employed. A very good example is the work from home phenomena. So there's obviously a lot of benefits in taking traffic off the streets, whether it's environmental, energy, or time wasted in congestion or commuting. Obviously there are other benefits as well that have indirect and direct impacts on infrastructure as well as people's well-being. So let's track it back a bit and talk a little about smart cities, or what the movement in smart cities is. So essentially, if you look at it from the perspective of the field of smart cities per se, initially it was more technology led. In a sense, there was a lot of vendors who were trying to force change within public sector entities and bring in technological efficiencies within the public space. As we progressed, we saw governments and local councils get more engaged in this field, and it tended to be more of a government-led initiative. Again, more towards efficiencies and sometimes towards KPIs and international agreements, where things like sustainability, energy management, and so forth came into play. Finally, and this is, I think, I'd like to call it the third wave of smart cities, is more community-led. It's essentially a bottom-up approach, and this is actually where social impact, citizen engagement, things like this come to the fore. And now we can talk about things like quality of life. So nobody likes to commute. I think nobody likes to be stuck in an hour or two of traffic either way, and that is one of the problems that we are facing, obviously, with the current mobility trends. We just end up building more and more infrastructure just because there are more and more cars on the road, without looking at what are the different ways that we can deal with these situations. Now, there have been some policy drivers, but not so effective. For example, you have policy drivers that have odd number license plates on a certain day and then even number license plates on another day. And the effectiveness of such schemes can be debatable. But what's more interesting now is that with the advent of digital and the different technologies we have at our disposal, and I won't actually talk a lot about the technologies, but the effects of those technologies, we can actually start seeing societal change. To do that, we might need to track back a bit. So historically, the civilizations that are built around cities, especially the old cities that are known to be extremely citizen-friendly, livable, tend to be cities that grew organically in a time when the automobile wasn't the king of the road. So a lot of cities today are planned around cars and the infrastructure that is required for cars, whether it's parking or the expressways and the highways and the tolls and getting around, rather than humans. Now, historically, cities, as I mentioned, the historical cities, used to be what you would call a 15 or 20-minute city. Essentially, you would live near a major resource like water or energy, and then anything you needed to do during your day would be walkable within 15 or 20 minutes from where you lived. So whether it's school or work or whatever you're doing. And even after the Industrial Revolution, we saw that, yes, people were shipped out or shipped in from the outskirts where the factories or pollution creation industries were, or people would be housed within those facilities, and we saw the growth of public transport. The entire script changed after we had automobiles enter the fray. Essentially, the idea of suburbia and being spread out, mostly evidenced in American cities initially, but now it's affecting a lot of the rest of the world, especially Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa. we saw this urban sprawl. Along with it came all the challenges. So we know the challenges, won't need to repeat it. But essentially what we see now is a collection of neighborhoods that are stitched together by these massive highways. Now, one thing that these highways end up doing is creating islands of communities. They actually divide. You can't cross the highway on foot. The other thing is that it creates an artificial barrier to get things done. You know, my school would be in one area, my office is in another, the pharmacy is in a third, and so forth. So every little task requires you to just jump in your car, and convenience and cost has to come into play in this. And we end up using the car, and that's why, again, there's always this optimization or growth of infrastructure that supports automobiles. Now, a lot of cities, especially in Southeast Asia, let's localize this a bit, have woken up to this fact and have started mass public transport schemes. You know, there's a lot of infrastructure being built around metros and buses and so forth. But at the same time, and I think it's not uncommon, that car ownership is also associated with economic prosperity and status. So we see a lot of people converting into car owners, you know, becoming car owners. And essentially, there is obviously convenience involved with this as well. But the flip side is that this is what causes all what, you know, the ills of cities as well. So congestion, environmental pollution, energy being wasted, and all the time that is wasted, and then the mental health issues as a result of being stuck in traffic and so forth. And the movement now, as I said, community-based smart cities, is towards conservation, sustainability, and also simpler solutions. So obviously we've all come across some of these simple solutions that we're going through in the sense of bike sharing schemes, car sharing schemes, you know, short-term rentals for cars, carpooling, but that didn't really take off here. And then you have these electric scooters. And then moving on, there's all this future tech talk of drones and autonomous vehicles, as well as electric shuttles and so forth. Now at different stages they're all feasible, but it always depends on the local community in the city. So a very good example would be electric shuttles. Now this is something that, let's say in the area I live in, the community I live in, it's about 20,000 people, there's about 1,000 businesses within that area, small businesses primarily, and they have a mix of residential and commercial and retail. Now ideally I should be able to do everything within my area and not feel the need to actually exit my area to do most of my daily tasks. Unfortunately, that's not the ideal situation. Also, the other problem is that I need to get in my car even to go somewhere in my community, because quite honestly the walkways aren't so pedestrian friendly. The traffic isn't pedestrian friendly, and I'd like to take my bike out, but I can't. It's actually very unsafe. And so those are the challenges. And essentially, it's both policy, technology, as well as public engagement that would better this situation. So on the one hand, you have policy which drives better community development in the sense of having services local, producing and consuming locally, prosumers if you want to call it. That's one major shift that's happening and will happen as we go along in this journey. The other is obviously from a planning side as well, as in taking back the streets from the cars and actually making it more friendly for pedestrians, cyclists, and other forms of transport that are not, one man in a car kind of scenario. And finally, it's also to do with zoning laws. There are certain zoning laws that are from 100 years ago that most of us apply almost blindly, which was basically, industrial, commercial, retail, residential, which doesn't necessarily apply now. And I think COVID-19 again opened our eyes to this, is that most of us can, in the knowledge economy, a majority of us can do our work. The office is very similar to the home environment. Why is it not that you could have an office building and a residential block in the same area, or even within the same building? And it's quite feasible. And this is essentially the kind of multi-use districts that are being developed. Now, this is an interesting concept, and this now goes to the commercial side and the developers, is the development of what are called transit-oriented developments, TODs. Now, TOD is essentially are multi-use districts. So when I say multi-use, it means you have retail, you have food and beverage, you have hospitality like a hotel, you have offices, lofts and so forth, even light industrial in certain cases, and then you have residential all within the same block. And the movement within that block is usually by foot, but alternatives are bikes or electric scooters. And for those who are differently able, you could have the addition of electric shuttles as an example, which could be autonomous as well. I mean, the technology is there, is fairly commonly available, and within a constrained environment like the TOD, you could actually use these electric shuttles quite seamlessly. And then outside of these TODs, there are major links coming in, like public transport or even connectivity in other ways, maybe through cars and stuff. So this is the movement which we're looking at now from enterprise or a corporate perspective. How do we address these? What are we doing about these? So on a very basic level is the recognition of work from home, hashtag WFH, that there should be actually incentives attached with this, either on a government level or even on an enterprise level, where we need to move away from this idea that you need to clock in and clock out and, people present to do work. I mean, there are certain situations that require presence, but not every situation requires that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have the availability and use of the technology that enables this. And on the third hand, you have things like HR policies and stuff, which should actually encourage, rather than treating people like school children, that encourage ownership of results. And that we're seeing already, actually. I think this is, in a way, an excellent development that has happened recently, that people are being entrusted to do their jobs remotely, and results are being looked at. So that's the first thing on the corporate side that you could do. Now, from an innovation perspective, now this is where things get interesting, is you have the opportunity for companies to innovate in developing autonomous vehicle technologies, being involved in the development and rollout of this infrastructure. Electric vehicles, electric shuttles, specifically within certain zones, within areas, and there are many examples of this happening in different parts of Europe and North America. And then also looking at how these technology changes can be rolled out in specific scenarios. So as I mentioned, a constrained environment like a TOD is almost like an ideal situation where you could have autonomous electric shuttles running around without people having to jump in a car to go to the grocery or the pharmacy or to visit your doctor. And finally, there is a very interesting development that's happening with the persuasive electric vehicle, or also the personal electric vehicle, which is, okay, I'm going to have a geek moment here. I'm going to talk about MIT. But it's from MIT Media Labs, the same guys who invented touchscreen and GPS. So they have got these bicycles or tricycles that roam around in a designated area. So, they have some kind of a track, and they essentially seek pedestrians who might need to use the bike. So it's an autonomous vehicle of sorts. It's electrically powered. And you can hail one, you can sit in it, and then you could manually pedal it to where you want to go, or you could actually just have it take you there. And essentially this covers actually a very interesting segment, which is differently able people who have, or you don't want to get sweaty, you're in your suit and you want to get to a meeting. So those kind of situations where biking or walking aren't always the ideal situation. So these are the developments that are happening now. All of this obviously is supported by an ecosystem of big data. You have the technologies like the different sensors that are out there, obviously the high-speed networks that are required to enable this, and the apps. Within this also is the ecosystem of payments or incentives, incentivizing people to work and carry out the economic activity locally, and there should be incentives to allow that to happen, so that people don't unnecessarily go and start using the road infrastructure or the automobiles, whichever it is. Even if it's an electric vehicle, it still has certain effects on the environment. So that's on the one side. On the other side is also allowing for seamless payments. So we're seeing that with the e-wallets being, coming into the market right now, and essentially automating the payment or making it easy, and then also micropayments. Now on the policy side, the government side, there can be additional incentives that can be enabled by the corporate sector, such as encouraging people to have a healthy lifestyle. So if you walked instead of taking your car from point X to point Y, you might take 15 minutes extra, but it's actually better for your health. It's better for the environment. There's energy savings involved in that as well, and we'll incentivize you by giving you a voucher for a free ice cream. Okay, a healthy ice cream as an example. So there are multiple ways to actually approach this, but and that also actually quite interestingly is the rise of the tokenized economy. So it doesn't, with the microtransactions, you could have something like a public blockchain or a token that encourages these behaviors and incentivizes people to behave in certain ways that allows. So it's, as you can see, it's a mixture of different things. So on the one side we have infrastructure, and I think you didn't hear me talk at all about autonomous vehicles and the infrastructure required for EV charging, because that train is already rolling, and we'll see where that gets. But what we need to look at is beyond, as in what is the future like. We can't keep optimizing systems that are already under strain and that aren't really helping the situation. We can keep throwing systems at that and optimize those, but that doesn't necessarily pave the way forward for us. The way forward has to be this more humanized approach, this more community-led approach, which is quality of life. Obviously, like I mentioned, there are international KPIs, environmental needs, energy, sustainability, and so forth. The nice words that the UN and the SDGs use, and so forth. But also there's an economic aspect to this as well, whether it's in savings on a micro level or all the way to a macro level. So there's different ways that we can look at this and how it impacts people. But at the end, the smartest city is the place where the community is happy, is healthy. It's not just happiness as an index. I think it's more about and how do we make our existing communities, we might not be in ideal communities, how do we start moving towards that ideal? So I think, and transportation, mobility, each one of us has had a personal experience through these lockdowns. I think it does matter a lot to us. But also we've learned something that many of us can actually do without having to jump into the car just because we want a bottle of Coke.